Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading The Warmth That Changed It All by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 5. Their First Date. Weiss Schnee. A loud knock interrupted Weiss as she stood in her closet and broke her train of thought. She had spent the whole night trying to decide what she could wear for her date with Young, and even though she had a closet the size of an ordinary living room full of clothes, she had yet to come up with anything. With a sigh, she turned and left the closet so as to not make the person who knocked wait. "Come in," Weiss said as she flattened out her dress and sat on the bed. The door opened and Klein entered the room carrying a tray. "Your evening tea, Miss Schnee," he said with a small bow of his head before he placed it on her bedside table. "Thank you, Klein." Weiss gave the man a small smile. Klein had been the family butler since before she had even been born, and she couldn't remember a single day which he hadn't been present in some manner. The man probably her most trusted confidant inside the Schnee manor, as he had always been kind and taken the time to cheer her up when she was upset. "Forgive me, Miss Schnee," Klein said as he stood there with his hands behind his back, "but you have been rather quiet lately. Is everything okay?" Weiss sighed and stood up. The man had kept many of her secrets before, so there was no reason he wouldn't now. "I'm just worried," Weiss groaned. "I have a date tomorrow, but it is not exactly someone Father would approve of." "I find there is a lot Mr. Schnee does not approve of," he replied with a frown. "But if you feel this girl is good enough for you, then his opinion should not matter." "How did you know it was a girl?" Weiss questioned. She had never once talked to Klein about any of her romantic interests, so she was confused as to how he knew. The man let out a chuckle that made his walrus mustache quiver. "Miss Schnee," the man said as he shook his head, your sister and your brother are the closest thing to children I have. I have made sure to pay attention over the years." Weiss felt herself smile at the man's admission. "That is very kind of you, Klein," Weiss replied, "and thank you for the advice." "It's my pleasure, Miss Schnee." Klein bowed and began to make his way towards the door. "If you need any more assistance, please call." "Actually," Weiss called, "I am in need of a driver I can trust tomorrow. I don't suppose you know of one." "I do believe I know of one," he said after a moment of thought. "His name is Hazel Reynard. I will ensure that he is free tomorrow. Just call for him when you are ready." "Thank you, Klein." Weiss breathed a sigh of relief now she no longer had to worry about that. "Of course," the man said and left the room. After Klein left, Weiss stood and returned back to her closet. She looked at the mass of blue, red, and white that lined the wall and let out another sigh. 30 minutes later, she had inspected a majority of the outfits she liked the best and was beginning to lose hope when she remembered that there was one outfit she hadn't yet worn. She moved to the back of her closet and pulled apart the hangers that held her old-school clothes to reveal a small shelf. The shelf had been a good hiding place for the past couple of years, since that part was rarely ventured to since she had finished school. However, the only thing that remained on there was a single white box emblazoned with a picture of Atlas symbol, a spear on 2 gears. She took it down and pulled off the top to reveal a letter sitting on top of white fabric. She picked up the letter and gave it a quick reread. "I know black is not usually a color you wear, but I believe this is to your taste. Winter." Weiss put the letter aside with a smile. Since Klein had given it to her, she had been too busy to actually look at the outfit properly, so with eager hands, she pulled the first article of clothing from the box and held it out before her. It was a white, double-breasted, high-collared jacket made of a material Weiss didn't recognize. It felt as smooth as silk, but it was thick enough that it was clearly very warm. Black lace trim was placed around the cuffs and collar. Winter was correct. The jacket was very much to her taste. She placed the jacket carefully to the side and eagerly pulled out the next item. The next piece was just as perfect. A white, pleated skirt that flared out, much like a ballerina's tutu, due to thick frills of black lace on the inside. Underneath the skirt was a pair of white knee-high boots with black heels, and a pair of black stockings with more lace at the top. Satisfied with everything she saw, Weiss quickly jumped to her feet and began to change into the outfit. Fortunately, it was very easy to get on, and it wasn't long before she moved in front of the closet mirror to examine how it looked. It was perfect. The white fabric gave her pale skin some much-needed color, and the black trims were just subtle enough to stand out, but not enough to pull too much attention. She turned around slowly to check it out from all angles, and with each one, she loved what she saw more and more. The skirt and boots worked beautifully together to show off her long legs, while only showing a small amount of her thighs. In fact, it was pretty much the only part of skin the outfit showed. The jacket itself was long-sleeved, and it had a V-shaped neckline that stopped just above her cleavage. Weiss could have stood in the mirror inspecting it for longer, but it was already getting late, and she knew she would have to get the outfit downstairs for it to be ready in time for her date tomorrow. With a reluctant sigh, she changed into her nightgown and placed the outfit back in its box. Asterisk. Yang Xiaolong. Yang was greeted to the sounds of playful shouting as she entered the house, along with a smell she recognized as cookies that emanated from the kitchen and made the whole house smell like a bakery. "Smells good, Rubes," Yang called out as she removed her shoes from her aching feet and threw them into a small cupboard by the door. "I hope you made me some." Yang picked up the bag of groceries that she had just purchased and made her way to the kitchen to unload it all. She entered the room to find her father, Taiyang, leaning up against one of the kitchen counters eating a cookie. He was wearing his usual brown, sleeveless shirt with a vest and orange cargo pants. "Hey Spitfire, how was college?" he asked as she placed the bags on the kitchen table. "Boring, as usual," she replied and began to sort through her items. "How was work?" Same old, he said as he pushed himself off the counter and pulled an item from the bag with a raised eyebrow. "Cheyenne pork? This couldn't have been cheap." "It wasn't," Yang replied and pulled the meat from his hand. "But good ingredients never are." Her father dug his hand back into the bag and pulled out some more items, giving each of them a similar look as he did the pork. "Mistral noodles, kitchenashi mushrooms," he listed off. "Yang, you can't afford these ingredients." "Yes, I can," she argued stubbornly despite being fully aware that her father knew how much she earned. "I have some saved up." "I thought that was FO. "Dad, will you just stop?" Yang interrupted angrily and looked at him pointedly. "I know what I'm doing." The hurt that filled Taiyang's eyes briefly, as he understood her meaning instantly made her feel guilty. She took a deep breath and lowered her head slightly, as she felt the stubbornness ebb away. "Sorry," she mumbled. "I just want things to be perfect." "I know," he replied and put a hand on her shoulder. "And it will be, but you don't need to break the bank to make it so. This girl could probably taste if I use cheap things." Yang turned and continued to unpack. "Yang, a good chef can take the most mundane of ingredients and turn it into something spectacular," Taiyang said and began to help putting things away. "And you haven't served me anything I wouldn't expect from a fancy restaurant since you were 14. I guess." "I know," he said firmly. "So stop worrying. Now, how long till she gets here?" Yang craned her neck to see the clock in the living room. "An hour and a half," she replied. "All right." He nodded and put the last of the food away. "When your sister gets back, we will head out. Until then, I will be in my chair, smelling the food I will never get to try." He finished the sentence with a fake pout in her direction as he moved towards the living room, and she couldn't help but smile despite her nerves. The next hour passed relatively quickly as Yang was busy preparing the food, and with 20 minutes left to go, she finally decided to wash her hair and get ready. She was halfway dressed when she heard the doorbell ring. "Fuck!" Yang swore to herself as she heard her father answer the door. Determined to get there before her father did too much to embarrass her, Yang quickly pulled on her jeans and socks and rushed out the door. Asterisk. Weiss Schnee. Weiss stepped out of the car and looked around her. Yang's neighborhood was a modest one. It wasn't fancy like the neighborhood she was used to, but the houses were nice. The street was mainly bungalows with the occasional two-floor house, but they all gave off a warm glow in the darkening light of the late hour. "Enjoy your time at the library, Miss Schnee," her driver, Hazel, called from the front seat in an exceptionally deep voice. "Message me when you are ready to be picked up." "Thank you, Hazel," she replied. She stepped away from the car as he drove away and made her way to the house number Yang had sent her. A quick look at her watch told her she was a little early, and she let out a reluctant sigh. The fog of her breath rose in front of her, and a small shiver began to settle in. While the new outfit was warm, she had chosen to neglect a scarf or gloves. Deciding she didn't want to risk getting ill, she reached out a hand and knocked on the door. The door opened to reveal a tall, attractive man with bright blonde hair and scraggly facial hair. His eyes looked kind, and a warm smile similar to Yang's was painted across his face. For some reason, she hadn't given a single thought to potentially meeting Yang's family. "You must be my daughter's date?" the man said in a friendly voice. "Yes, sir," Weiss replied as she straightened out her posture, an action that had been imposed on her since she was a child. "Weiss Schnee." One of the man's eyebrows raised slightly, but other than that he made no further indication at the name. "Tiong Xiao Long." He held out his hand, and she cautiously reached out to shake it. "Call me Tai, sir, makes me feel old." Before Weiss was able to reply, a breathless Yang emerged by her father and gave him a swift elbow to get him out of the way. "Hey, Weiss!" She panted slightly and finished pulling on a flannel shirt over her black t-shirt. "Please come in." Weiss nodded and stepped inside. The smell of herbs permeated the warm air that greeted her. The living room was actually rather large, larger than any in the Schnee mansion, but it was also much more alive. Whereas the mansions were cold and barely furnished, Yang's gave of an almost welcoming feel. The walls were painted a light brown and were littered with family photographs and drawings that she guessed were done by Yang. The floor was made of beautiful dark wood, and a large green mat was spread across a majority of it. A dark green couch sat in the middle of the room facing a flat-screen television, accompanied by a few other smaller chairs, even a recliner that Yang's father was now sat in. Shelves were fixed all around the room that held an odd assortment of things from books to ornaments, and even more family photos. "What do you think?" Yang asked in a hopeful voice. "It feels like a home." Weiss smiled at her. "Thanks." The girl smiled back, her lavender eyes glinting with happiness. "You look amazing, by the way." "Oh, thank you." Weiss felt herself blush as she looked down at her clothes and back up at Yang. Yang's clothes were, admittedly, far more simple than her own, but that seemed to work in the girl's favor. The red, open, flannel shirt over a low-cut, plain, black t-shirt and the beige cargo pants suited her perfectly. It was also the first time she had seen Yang's hair down, as she usually wore it in a ponytail at work, and it was far more wild than Weiss could have imagined. It was almost as long as her own, but curls stuck up at all angles in an almost stylized way. Despite her countless hours in clothes stores talking to stylists, Weiss couldn't think of an outfit that would suit the girl better. "As do you." A small chuckle could be heard coming from the direction of Yang's father, and Weiss felt the blush harshen. "I thought you were going out, Dad," Yang said in a stern voice. All right. He chuckled as he got up from the chair. He picked up some keys from the table in front of the couch and made his way towards the door. "I should go pick up your sister anyway. She was supposed to be back an hour ago." "It was nice to meet you, S. Tai," Weiss offered. "You too, Weiss." He smiled and opened the door. "We should be back around 10. If you go out, make sure to let Vi out before you go." "Will do," Yang replied as he walked outside. With a simple nod, he closed the door and silence quickly filled the space. Weiss was determined not to let the awkward silence continue, as it often did when they were left alone. "So where is your sister?" she asked after a moment of staring at Yang. "Oh," the girl started and motioned toward the chairs. Weiss took it to mean she could sit down and made her way over to them. "Probably working on one of our neighbor's old cars. She always loses track of time." Weiss gave a nod and sat down on the chair. Despite its slightly worn look, it was actually rather comfortable. "Well, Yang said hesitantly. "I should get dinner started. It won't take too long." "You said you like pork, right?" "Absolutely," Weiss smiled. Good, Yang replied as she wrung her hands. "Well, feel free to snoop or watch the TV." With that, Yang gave her one last smile and ducked through a doorway on the other end of the room. Now alone, Weiss took a couple of minutes to look around the room properly and noticed a picture of 4 people next to the television. Knowing she had permission from Yang to snoop, she got up from the chair and picked it up. All 4 of the subjects were covered in snow, but smiles adorned each of their faces. 2 of the people were very familiar to her, however the others were not. Clearly a mother and her daughter with shoulder-length, black hair, and while the older of the 2 had dyed the tips of her hair red, the younger was still a spitting image of her mother. The smiles gave Weiss a warm feeling in her stomach as she looked at it, and she was so transfixed that she hadn't realized Yang had poked her head back into the room. Wise. Yang's voice caused her to jump slightly. Yes? I asked if you wanted anything to drink? The girl repeated. Wine. Water? I think we've got some fizzy drinks left. Water is fine, thank you, Wise replied as she placed the picture back where she had got it from. Yang disappeared for a couple of seconds and returned with a tall glass of cold water that she graciously accepted. Wise took a sip and followed Yang into the kitchen as the smell of delicious meat had already begun to spread through the house, and she was eager to see what Yang was cooking. It smells wonderful, Wise complimented the girl as she walked into the kitchen. What is it? Thanks, Yang replied. Her hair was once again up, and Wise noted she seemed a little more confident than she did earlier. It's just a simple pork and hoisin stir fry. Well, it sounds delicious. Yang sent a smile her way as she continued to stir the food, and Wise returned it happily. So I'm guessing that was RWBY in the picture? Wise asked in an attempt to keep the conversation going. Which one? Yang replied, letting out a small chuckle at Wise's confusion. Yeah, that's Rubes. She looks more and more like Mom every year. Yang had already told her about her mother passing away when she was a child, so Wise wasn't surprised to hear a small hint of sadness in the girl's voice. I'm sorry, Wise said quickly. I didn't mean to bring up bad memories. Nah, it's fine, Yang replied with a shake of her head. It happened a long time ago. How did it happen? Wise asked hesitantly. Car crash, she said offhandedly. It wasn't long after that picture was taken, actually. The roads were still a little icy, and she lost control. That's awful, Wise replied as she held her glass a little tighter. I can't imagine losing someone you love like that. It was rough. Yang nodded as she pulled 2 plates from a nearby cupboard and looked at her with a smile. But enough about that. Food's just about ready. Table or front room? It's your house. Which do you prefer? Wise asked in return. Normally at home, she would sit in the dining room and eat with the family, but she didn't want to impose too much since it was Yang who had done all the cooking. Front room's got a TV, Yang said with a wink as she leant down and pulled a large wooden tray from another cupboard. Wise stifled a chuckle and watched as the girl dished out 2 even plates of amazing-looking food and poured the rest into a tub that she placed into the oven. They'll eat that later. Yang smiled and picked up the tray with the plates on it and walked towards the living room. Mind grabbing my drink? Wise grabbed what looked to be a small glass of wine from the counter and followed her into the living room, where she had already placed the tray on the table in front of the couch. She watched as Yang pulled up a couch cushion. Is everything okay? Wise asked, confused as to what the girl was doing. Can't find the TV remote. She looked up and smiled while moving on to the next cushion. I'm beginning to think Blake hides it whenever she... Uh-huh. Yang held up the controller in triumph and quickly turned on the television. Fortunately, turned it down so that it was only just audible and put on a channel dedicated to rock music. Should have known you were a rock girl, Wise laughed as she sat down on the recently disturbed couch. I can change it if you want, Yang replied quickly. No, Wise smiled. I much prefer classical, but rock has its charms too. Ah, classical, Yang playfully snickered as she sat down and picked up her plate. How rich of you. Well, I am very rich, Wise replied playfully, and took Yang picking up her plate as an indicator that it was okay to eat on the couch. Wise carefully lifted up a forkful of food and took her first bite. A beautiful explosion of flavor filled her mouth, and she had to suppress a satisfied groan. Both the noodles and the pork were cooked perfectly, and every bite had just enough seasoning that none of the ingredients overwhelmed any of the others. This is amazing, Wise breathed after swallowing her mouth full. I aim to impress, Yang replied and gave a little bow, or as much as she could with her legs crossed on the couch. So, anything exciting happened today? Wise shook her head as she swallowed the food in her mouth. Not really. I spent a majority of the day at Father's office downtown, she replied. You? Well, my coach told me that I've qualified for a tournament in November. Yang smiled. That's great news, Wise replied. I know, Yang replied as she took another bite and covered her mouth. So what do you do at your dad's company? I mainly just sit in on meetings, Wise sighed. Or watch some higher-up go about his usual business. That sounds fun, Yang said hesitantly. Weiss let out a small laugh at the girl's attempt to be considerate. It's really not, she said. I wish father would allow me to do more. Have you tried telling him you want to do more? Of course, but apparently I'm not ready despite having pointed out multiple mistakes his head accountant has made over the past couple of years. Weiss shook her head. Well, he's an idiot then, Yang replied as she took a sip of wine. So is that what you want to do when you're older? Run your father's company? While it was intended as a simple question, it was more complex than Yang knew, and Weiss didn't know how to answer it properly. Sort of, Weiss said with a frown. Sort of? I want to run the company my grandfather made, Weiss started to explain. But I'm currently heiress to the thing my father has twisted it into. I'm sure you have heard the controversies. Kinda hard to miss. Yang nodded. And those are just the ones the public knows about, Weiss admitted. Well, maybe you could fix it, Yang said hopefully. When you take over, I mean. I hope so. I already have ideas about how I can do so, Weiss smiled. I would ask what they are, but I doubt I would understand a single word, Yang joked. I will spare you the details then, Weiss chuckled. But what about you? Do you want to box professionally, or is there something else you want to do? I would love to box professionally, Yang replied as Weiss took another bite of her quickly depleting food. Although, what I really want is to own a restaurant. With how good your food is, I don't see you having a problem finding customers, Weiss replied with a smile and a raised eyebrow. Yang let out a small laugh and finished up the last bit of her food before she replied. I will put that down as my first review then, Yang said, and placed her plate back on the table. Shni approved. So long as I get an invite to your opening, you can use my name for whatever you want, Weiss joked. Deal. Yang smiled and held out her hand for Weiss' empty plate. Not wanting Yang to have to handle cleanup as well as cooking, Weiss placed her plate on the tray instead and picked it up. While she did, she saw one of Yang's eyebrows arch as the girl uncrossed her legs and stood up. I wash you dry? She asked and turned up the volume on the television slightly before making her way to the kitchen. Sure, Weiss replied and followed her. The cleanup didn't take too long since they worked together while engaging in some more small talk. With everything put away, Weiss watched Yang pull a small box out of the cupboard and pull out a couple of cookies. Ruby won't mind if you rob some. The girl grinned as she handed one to Weiss and took a bite of her own. Though she wasn't a big fan of sweets, Weiss gladly accepted the cook took a bite. They were obviously recently cooked as they were still rather moist, but the overwhelming sweetness instantly made Weiss regret taking the bite. That is a lot of sugar. Weiss coughed and placed remaining bits of cookie on the counter, earning a small laugh from Yang. Sorry, I always tell her not to put too much sugar in, but that's Ruby for you. The girl smiled and picked up the discarded biscuit and taking a large bite. Mom's fault. How come? Weiss asked out of interest. Well, Ruby used to help Mom bake all the time, and she would let Ruby add the sugar, Yang explained. You grew up on those? Weiss remarked playfully. How do you all still have teeth? Yang let out a full genuine laugh at the question, and it took her a couple of seconds to compose herself afterwards. Mom never served those ones, Yang replied with a wide grin on her face. She'd cook her own while Ruby was off busy doing other things. She sounds amazing, Weiss said as she wiped off the side where she had placed the biscuit. She was, Yang nodded. Me and Dad haven't had the heart to tell Ruby about the cookie thing though. I like that you don't want to ruin her memories, she smiled at Yang. Even though it would reduce her chances of developing diabetes. Thanks, Yang replied and took a sip from her drink. So what's your mom like? I hear a lot about your dad, but you don't talk about her much. There's not really much to tell, Weiss shrugged. We were close when I was young, but some things happened that made us grow apart. Weiss knew exactly what had happened, but she didn't feel ready to talk about those things just yet. Any chance you will reconnect? Yang asked, her voice soft since she was clearly trying not to push too much. Sometimes I think so, Weiss nodded after a moment's silence. But there are times I barely recognize her. That sucks, Yang mumbled. But I don't think you should give up. I haven't. Weiss smiled and knew the girl cared enough to try and support her. I'm just waiting for the right time is all. Yang said nothing but gave a simple nod as she looked at a clock on the windowsill. Weiss looked over to see that the clock showed it was 20 minutes to 10. Speaking of time, Dad will be home soon. Yang sighed. You can stick around for a bit longer if you want. You can meet Ruby. I would, but I really should get going. Weiss replied and felt bad when she saw Yang's face drop slightly. But I wouldn't mind a quick walk around the neighborhood while I wait for my driver. Oh yeah. Yang's face lifted into a smile. Let me just grab my jacket and let the dog out. While Yang was retrieving her coat, Weiss sent a quick message to Hazel letting him know she was ready to be picked up. Just as she hit send, Yang returned wearing a cream-colored jacket with black sleeves. While it didn't exactly match her cargo pants, the jacket itself was rather nice. Nice jacket, Weiss complimented the girl. I know. Yang grinned smugly. You ready? Weiss nodded and followed the girl out of the house into the dark street. A chill greeted them as they stepped out, and they both pulled their jackets a little tighter to stop from shivering. After a minute standing outside the house, Yang turned right on the sidewalk and she followed. They walked at a gentle pace in silence for the first couple of minutes, each simply enjoying the presence of the other. For some reason, Yang always seemed to exude an aura of warmth so Weiss, and since it was their first time walking together, she allowed herself to take it in. So, Yang breathed, her voice tinged with nerves. As first dates go, how did I do? Weiss let out a little chuckle at the girl's question. Well, I wasn't scoring you out of 100, Weiss joked. But I would say at least high 80s. Wow, Yang laughed at the reply. Better than I expected. You expected to mess up? It's sort of my speciality, Yang said flippantly before letting her tone fade back into a semi-serious one. But a little. It wasn't exactly the fanciest date ever. Weiss looked at Yang to see that the girl's head was hanging slightly. Eager to cheer the girl up, she reached out as they walked and carefully took the girl's hand. She felt Yang tense up a little at the contact, but after a moment, she returned the pressure. Weiss watched as the frown that had previously been painted across Yang's face turned into a blushing smile. Yang, Weiss said slowly, I have grown up around fancy restaurants, posh museums, and royal theater. And while they are nice, they are pretty much all the same. Weiss stopped and turned to face the girl. Tonight, you invited me into your home and showed me what it was like to be a normal person on a normal date, Weiss said pointedly. So no, it may not have been the fanciest, but it was definitely the best date I've been on. As Weiss finished, she saw Yang's cheek turn slightly red, whether from the increasing chill or her own words she did not know, but she chose to believe it was the latter. It was while she was staring at the girl's blush that Yang raised her head slightly, and their eyes locked. Warmth flooded her system, and her breath caught as she realized the situation they were in. Fortunately, a pair of lights came round the corner and broke their reverie. As they blushed and subtly shook their heads clear, the car came to a stop beside the both. I'm guessing that's your ride, Yang smiled. Yeah, Weiss replied as she looked into the window, and saw Hazel drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. Well, Yang paused briefly. I will text you tomorrow. Weiss nodded and leant forward to kiss Yang on the cheek. Despite not wanting the night to end, she knew that her father would grow suspicious if she was away from the mansion for too much longer. With the parts of her face still blazing from its contact with Yang's, she pulled away and gave the girl a wide smile. Good night, Yang. Night. Weiss slipped hand-free to open the door to her car and stepped in. The warmth of the vehicle was nice, but it lacked the welcoming feel of Yang's aura, and she immediately regretted having to depart from the girl so soon. Home, Miss Schnee? She heard Hazel call from the driver's seat. Yes, please. As the car pulled away, Weiss waved goodbye to Yang and quickly found herself eager for the next time she would see the girl. Chapter 6, The New Overseer. Weiss Schnee. The hallways of the STC, Schnee Technology Company, headquarters had always been Weiss' most hated part of the building. The way the bright lights reflected off the stark white walls quite often resulted in giving her a migraine that would persist for hours. However, she knew that her father would not change it anytime soon. He was a man who revealed in their family color that her grandfather had become renowned for wearing, and made it a point to show it wherever he could. He had even dyed his hair the instant he had begun to gray. In her fruitless attempt to stave off the migraine, Weiss hastened her stride, but as she pushed open her target door, she could already feel the first twinges of pain pulse through her head. Unfortunately, she knew what awaited her would only make it worse. "Oh great, you're here," said the sarcastic drawling voice of a man sitting at a desk. The walrus mustache, tailored gray overcoat, and maroon undercoat showed he was a man who reveled in high society. Dr. Arthur Watts, the head of research and development. Also probably the most insufferable man Weiss had ever had the misfortune to meet, and she had been raised by Jacques Schnee. In fact, Weiss was quite certain she had never heard a word from the man that wasn't either a snide remark or a direct insult. "I am," Weiss spoke clearly and raised her head to show her authority. "Father has asked me to work down here for the next month to oversee your department." "And what is it he expects you, a college girl with no expertise in this field, to oversee?" "Father has concerns that both work and standards seem to have dropped lately," Weiss elaborated. "I'm here to ensure that your department does not continue to fall short and make cuts if need be." A sneer took over the man's face and lifted his mustache to overtake his nose. Despite hating the man, she tried her best not to laugh so as to maintain her professional appearance. After a couple of moments, he scoffed in derision. "Falling standards? Doubtful," he sneered as he pressed a button on his desk phone. "It's more than likely that your father is simply tired of you and has decided to pawn you off on me." Weiss was about to respond when the door to the office opened and a girl wearing a white shirt and blue skirt walked into the room. A gold star on the girl's forehead stood out against her dark skin, and navy blue hair hung down just below her ears. "Miss Soleil," Arthur addressed the girl without looking up from some papers he had pulled from his desk drawer. "Miss Schnee here has been instructed to check up on our department, and since I am much too busy to waste my time on such nonsense, I am leaving the task of showing her around and bringing her up to date to you." "No offense to Miss Soleil, but I would much prefer to be shown around by the department head," Weiss interrupted quickly. "And I would prefer not to have my time wasted by a spoilt little girl," he replied, his voice tinged with annoyance. "So like any good head of department, I have others assist me." As much as it pained her to admit it, she could not find any fault in his reasoning. "Very well." Weiss gave the man a nod and turned to the girl. "Then I am in your care for the rest of the day, Miss Soleil." Without bothering to look back, the two of them left the room. Regret filled her as the lights caused her to squint. She was not looking forward to a whole month of it. "So what is it you do here, Miss Soleil?" Weiss asked in a more polite tone than she has used with Watts as they started the stroll down the corridor. "I am Dr. Watts' personal assistant," the girl replied in a matter-of-fact voice. "As such, I am very familiar with the inner workings of the department." "And have you been here long?" Weiss asked tentatively since the girl looked only a little older than herself. 13 months next Friday," she replied. "That is some time," Weiss said. She could see there was no other option than to straight up ask the girl her age. "How old are you, might I ask?" 21, the girl replied, and Weiss swore she saw the faintest hint of a smile. "I graduated high school a year early and received my bachelor's in business management at 20. "That is quite an accomplishment," Weiss admitted. "Thank you," the girl said and bowed her head a little. They spent the rest of the short walk in silence until the girl finally pushed open a pair of double doors, and they entered the main workroom. Wasting no time, the girl began to show her around. Asterisk. The tour of the whole department had taken nearly 3 hours in total, and Weiss had filled almost her entire notepad with the details that Miss Soleil has given her. It was that notepad that Weiss was studying in one of the spare offices that she had claimed as her own. From what she had seen, Watts had been correct. The department was functioning pretty well on the surface, but she couldn't help but notice that there was a fair amount of tension amongst the workers. She had also noted that an overwhelming majority of the workers were human, with only 5 faunus in the whole department. Admittedly, this was only a problem if other faunus were being denied positions due to their race, but knowing how her father treated them, she had decided to take a closer look at that matter. On the bright side, however, she had met a few notable members that had impressed her. First off was Cécile Soleil herself. She was both smart and thorough. Her knowledge of not only the department, but almost all of its employees, had made Weiss wonder on more than one occasion during the tour as to why the girl had not yet sought a higher position in the company when she was clearly very capable. Second was a doctor by the name of Polendina. She had tried to write down the man's first name, but she had enough trouble understanding it, let alone spelling it. She had heard of him before due to his outstanding work on prosthetics, but the man was a delight to be around. Smart, imaginative, and fatherly were the only words she could use to describe him. He was also one of the few people who had not seized up the moment she entered the room and instead had greeted her with the type of smile one would give a lifelong friend. Weiss was halfway through her notes when a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," Weiss called as she looked up from her papers. The door opened and Seal entered carrying a large stack of folders. "Here are the files you asked for, ma'am," the girl said as she placed them on the edge of Weiss' newly claimed desk and split them into two piles, one much smaller than the other. "Is there any? So this is the closet you have made your own," said an irritatingly identifiable voice from the other side of the room. A quick glance past Seal revealed what's leaning against her door. "How quaint." "It will do for my purposes," Weiss said offhandedly as she positioned the stacked files into a more accessible position. "I'm sure," he smirked with a raised eyebrow. "So how was your little tour? Are you in need of some aspirin?" "Only when you are around, Arthur," Weiss fired back. "And the tour was just fine, thank you. Miss Soleil was extremely thorough. Speaking of, I would love to commandeer Miss Soleil's services during my time here, so long as it is okay with the both of you. It makes no difference to me." Weiss shrugged. "If you want her, take her." Seal gave Weiss a short nod after the man finished his sentence. "If you are in need of my services, then I am more than happy to help, ma'am." "Perfect," Weiss replied and threw a smile at Weiss as she knew it would annoy him. The man simply rolled his eyes and exited the room. Now that she had Seal under her, she could slowly begin to see if she was correct in assuming the girl was capable of more. "What would you like me to do first?" the girl asked. Weiss took a moment to think. She wanted to test the girl, but she didn't want to do it too soon. "Well," Weiss replied slowly, "what is it you usually do for Dr. Watts?" "Scheduling, correspondence, and ensuring his instructions make it to the rest of the department." Weiss gave the girl a nod and placed a hand on the large stack of documents the girl had bought in earlier. "These are all the proposed projects from the past year, including those currently in development, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good, then perhaps you can bring me the personnel file for—" Weiss pulled open the top document of the largest pile and looked at the name of the lead researcher. "Dr. Winchester. Then I would like you to sit down with me and help go through these files by telling me everything you know about each one." "Of course." The girl gave a short bow and exited the room. While Weiss waited for Seal to return, she continued to go through her earlier notes. Most of them were about the projects she had seen a little off or about employees she had met, but a few pages were dedicated to how the work environment felt. After 10 minutes of reading about some of the employees, Seal returned and took the seat opposite her. "Dr. Winchester's file, ma'am." As the girl placed the file on the table, Weiss immediately took note of a rather large green section in the middle of the file. Green was the color of Human Resources complaint forms, and told her that this particular file was going to be a rather interesting read. Asterisk. 4 hours later, and they had only made it through half of the stack of proposed ideas. Most of them were half-baked concepts, most of which would require a huge amount of funding for something that would likely result in nothing, but scattered between them was the occasional promising idea that had either been overlooked or just plain rejected for some reason. However, she found that beside Dr. Polendina, Dr. Winchester had quite a few proposed projects that became more and more troubling as she read them. He was undoubtedly very smart, but most were proposals for different types of weapons and instruments of war, and while she appreciated advancements in protecting the country, the man's personnel file revealed that those intentions were far from his mind. There were numerous reports of both sexual and racial behavior toward fellow employees, and even some of violence and threatening behavior. As Weiss read further and further into his file, she became more and more convinced that he was less in the interest of protecting the country than seeing a return to the times of subjugation. The fact that he had not yet been fired was astounding to her. Before she had even finished reading it, she had decided that he was more trouble than he was valuable, and marked him down to be removed as soon as she could. "Ma'am?" Seal's voice broke Weiss' concentration on yet another of Dr. Winchester's weapon proposal, and she looked up to see the girl was once again on her feet. Over the hours, the girl had been sent multiple times to retrieve certain files, and Weiss was beginning to feel guilty for making her walk so much. "Sorry, what did you say?" "It's time for my lunch break. Would you like me to pick you up anything?" the girl repeated. "Oh, if it's not too much trouble," Weiss said, and received a shake of the girl's head in response. She once again felt guilty for wasting the girl's potential on bringing her food, but she was admittedly very hungry. "There is a small coffee shop called Black Cat Coffee. Just say my name, and they will know my order. I will call my driver to take you there." "Of course, ma'am." Seal nodded and made her way towards the door. "Wait," Wise called to her and frantically searched for a piece of paper. "Would you mind delivering a note for me while you are there?" Wise saw Seal nod again as she found a piece of paper and began to write out a quick message. As she did, she pressed a button on her scroll to call for her driver. "Sorry, I have not stopped by lately. Things at the company have been rather busy, but if you are free next Saturday at 8 p.m., let me know and I will pick you up. Dress smart/casual and don't eat too much. Wise X." She could have easily sent it by text, but she had always loved receiving letters, and she hoped that Yang would find the charm in it too. "Ask for Yang and hand it to no one else but her," Wise said pointedly as she folded the knot and tucked it into an envelope from her drawer. She knew for a fact that Yang had only recently started her shift and would be there. "Understood," Seal said and took the envelope from her. "Thank you." Wise smiled at the girl. "The car should be waiting for you downstairs. You will know it. And write your lunch down as one of my expenses too." "Thank you, ma'am," Seal said as she left the room. As she waited for the reply and her lunch, she decided to tackle some of the green-lighted projects. Asterisk. Weiss was almost done with a pretty by-the-book new design for scrolls when Seal returned with the food. Weiss quickly stood up and took the coffee from her and took a sip as the rest of the food was placed on the desk. "I also have a message for you," Seal said and pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag. Weiss tried to keep a neutral face as she took the paper and quickly read the note. "I missed you too, but don't worry about it, and am always free for you, but I hope I get to see you before then. Yang XXX. Also, I love the new courier method. It's so posh of you." A small, hastily drawn picture of a face with its tongue stuck out followed the last line, and Weiss knew that her face had broken into a smile against her will. "Good news?" Seal asked as she sat down and pulled a container towards herself. "Very good news," Weiss replied and followed suit. Chapter 7, Secret. Weiss Schnee. The past couple of days had seemed like fall to be trying its best to preserve its final days of warmth before winter rolled around and froze everything over, and in seeing this, Weiss took her time to slowly make her way towards the waiting car in an attempt to enjoy as much of the day as she could. The day had felt so much longer than usual. Not only had she been woken up by shouting in front of the house due to a reporter attempting to sneak to the house, but she had also had to contact Seal to organize a few meetings throughout the day. While she knew many of them promised to be dull, there were two that she was looking forward to after having obtained permission from her father the previous night. However, the most draining part of the day had been the annual 4-college transfer. Every year, the 4 colleges of Remnant, Haven, Shade, Atlas, and Beacon engaged in a 2-week exchange where 10 students from 3 of the colleges would travel to the hosting college. Unfortunately, it was Beacon's turn to accept the visiting students, and Weiss had been asked to show the students of Shade around Beacon's grounds, a task that had taken a full 2 hours and had meant she had to come in much earlier than usual. Adding all of that to her classes and the upcoming meetings, it was no wonder that the warm air had been tempting her to sleep all day. "Miss Schnee," Hazel Reynard's deep voice snapped her from her thoughts. "Is everything okay?" "Yes, just tired is all," Weiss replied with a small smile. The man gave a short nod and opened the door for her to slide into the seat. She hadn't known what to think of the man when she had first met him. The word intimidating was an understatement. He was by far the tallest man she had ever met at what she had to guess was nearly 7 feet tall, if not more. And he was by no means a thin man. Every inch of him seemed to be rippling muscles, and his voice was so deep that she felt her bones vibrate whenever he talked. However, she had quickly found that he was very quiet, but not in the same way as other drivers she had had. Quite often they gave the feeling of wanting to talk, but being too scared to potentially annoy her, but Hazel was different. It was like he was completely uninterested, and if she was honest with herself, she quite liked that about the man. The silences didn't feel awkward like with others. Also, he was willing to lie to her father, which immediately made her like him more. "Where to?" "Black Cat Coffee, please," Weiss replied and slumped down a little in her seat. She felt the car gently vibrate to life and watched as the green lawns of Beacon began to slide out of view to be replaced by brown trees. The small stretch of remnants ocean that separated Beacon from Vale slightly visible between them. Weiss felt her eyelids begin to close as she watched the light dance between the trees, and unable to keep it at bay any longer, she finally succumbed. Asterisk. We've arrived, Weiss heard as she awoke a little while later to a gentle nudge from Hazel. Realizing that she had fallen asleep, Weiss immediately straightened up and cleared her throat. Oh! Weiss cleared her throat again as she heard it croak and quickly stepped out of the car. Thank you, Mr. Reinhardt. The man simply gave a grunt as his reply, and Weiss closed the door. How could she be so foolish? To fall asleep in the presence of someone who was technically a stranger was incredibly stupid of her. She continued to chastise herself as she walked through the door into the store and approached the counter, and only stopped when the sight of Jan wiped all of her previous stupidity from her mind. Oh my She gasped as the sight of the large, black eye that Jan was sporting. Jan, what happened? Nice to see you too. The girl smiled and leaned forward against the counter. Jan? Calm down, it's just a sparring accident. Jan chuckled. My partner got in a lucky shot. Right, boxing. You're still calling it a lucky punch? Weiss heard a voice say from under the counter. Yes, because that's what it was, Jan said as Blake emerged with a bag of coffee beans in her hands. Anyway, you look a little pale, Weiss. Are you feeling okay? Yes, it has just been a long day is all, Weiss sighed. Are you at least finished for the day? Jan asked, concern evident in her voice. I wish, she replied. I have some meetings I must attend to today. You can't call them off? Jan replied and let out a small sigh as Weiss shook her head. All right, well you can at least rest here until your first meeting. Hold on a sec. The tone of voice Jan used was gentle yet commanding, and Weiss knew she wouldn't be able to argue with the girl. She watched as Jan leaned in to whisper something to Blake that made her nod her head. Come with me. Jan motioned towards the edge of the counter, and Weiss was immediately confused. Where? Upstairs, Jan replied as she pulled open the small wooden gate that blocked off the store from behind the counter. Blake's got a super comfy couch. AR. Are you sure? Weiss asked, the question mainly directed at Blake. After Blake gave a slight nod, Weiss slowly made her way towards the gate and followed Yang through the door she had seen the girl disappear behind so often. She was greeted by a brightly lit, narrow kitchen that was only really wide enough for 2 people, but was exceptionally clean. Clearly Yang took great care of the area. She continued to follow Yang through a door at the end of the kitchen and up a flight of stairs to a plain black wooden door. That's not ominous at all, Weiss half joked and earned a chuckle from Yang. Just don't touch the skulls and you'll be fine. Yang winked as she opened the door. Encouraging. Yang gave her a small smirk as she ushered her through the door. The room she entered was actually rather pleasant. While a little sparse, it was clear to see that a lot of love had gone into its design. Bookshelves filled with books completely covered the walls and lead into what looked to be pillars with hanging plants dangling from the top. A long, dark brown couch sat in the middle of the room facing a large television. Still ominous? Yang's words come from right behind her ear, the girl's breath gently tickling its way down her neck and caused an involuntary shiver to run through her body. And no, Weiss stuttered as less than respectable idea began to fill her mind. Are you cold? Yang said, the slight hint of worry back in her voice. Take a seat, and I will turn up the heat a bit. Not wanting to clue Yang in on what had actually caused the shiver, Weiss simply gave a nod and took a seat on the couch. She quickly discovered Yang had not exaggerated about how comfy it was as she sank into cushions which felt softer than her mattress at home, an exceptionally comfy mattress that had undoubtedly cost more than everything in Blake's apartment. So when is your first meeting? She heard Yang ask from across the room. 4 o'clock. Perfect. Have you eaten today? I haven't really had the time for food, Weiss sighed. Well, I'm pretty sure Blake has some eggs, Yang said, as she made her way to the small kitchen in the corner of the room and began to search through the cupboards. You're okay with an omelet, right? You don't have to cook, Weiss replied. A sandwich from downstairs would be fine. I like cooking. Yang smiled as she pressed some buttons on the stove. Then an omelet is fine. But are you sure Blake is okay with you stealing her food? Please, I spend so many nights here that her dad jokes about me paying rent. Yang chuckled. Okay then. Weiss gave up and decided to change the subject. It does seem like a nice couch to sleep on. Yeah, I know. Yang shook her head as she pulled some things from the fridge. That thing is great for a short nap, but sleeping for more than half an hour will kill your back. So where do you sleep? Mostly with Blake. Yang shrugged. Weiss couldn't help the feeling of jealousy that tore its way through her. The idea of Yang and Blake sleeping in the same bed made her a little uncomfortable. You and Blake really are pretty close then? She asked slowly, not wanting to sound like she was accusing Yang of anything. As close as two people can be, I guess. Yang replied offhandedly as she began to busy herself with the food. You never actually told me how you met her? Weiss asked. Really? Weiss shook her head as she watched Yang cook and waited for an answer. Nothing special, honestly. Blake moved to Vale while we were in middle school. We were both teased for different reasons and sort of just ended up friends. Really? That's it? Yang laughed and poured some eggs she had beaten into a pan she had placed on the stove earlier. Not every story is like the ones in those books. Yang smiled and nodded towards one of the many bookshelves. True. Weiss had to agree. So has it always just been friends? You've never been anything more? She could have sworn she saw Yang fumble the pan handle slightly, but the girl quickly regained control. However, she didn't reply immediately, and the look on her face was one of contemplation. After a couple of seconds, the girl shook her head slowly. Yang paused and took a breath. I wanted more for a while, but you know. Different trees. Sorry, Weiss said, immediately regretting her decision to ask. That wasn't any of my business. It's fine. Yang shrugged and threw some more things into the pan. I've moved on from that. Good. Good? No, I didn't mean it like that. Weiss blushed and quickly began to think of excuses only to hear Yang slightly chuckling as she pulled a spatula from the drawer. Don't worry, you're not the first to ask, Yang said and pulled a plate from the cupboard. So what about you? What about me? Any romantic skeletons in the closet? Yang said with a wink. Oh. Weiss paused and thought for a second as she watched Yang tip what looked to be a perfectly cooked omelet onto the plate. There was a girl back in Atlas, but it wasn't anything serious. Wow, how scandalous, Yang said teasingly and walked over to the couch with the food. She cocked an eyebrow at Yang as she sat down on the couch and passed her the plate. Weiss' stomach gave a small rumble as she cut into the omelet, and melted cheese flowed from the middle. Flavor exploded in her mouth as she took the first bite, and her stomach immediately ached for more. Good? Weiss hummed as she swallowed her mouth full. Very. What's inside? Just your basic cheese, ham and chives. Yang shrugged and settled into the couch. So what's got you so busy, apart from work? College, mainly, Weiss replied before she took another bite. With all the coursework and now the annual transfer, I could just use a few more hours in the day. I know that feeling. Yang nodded. What's the transfer thing? Just some student from each of the 4 Ivy League colleges go to a host college each year, Weiss explained. I'm in charge of showing some of them around. For the briefest of moments, Weiss could have sworn she had seen Yang's face drop ever so slightly, but before she had even had time to think why, the smile was back on the girl's face. Sounds like an unnecessary hassle, Yang said, and pulled her feet up onto the couch to sit cross-legged. If you have so much to do already, can't you ask for someone else to do it? Not really, it was Father's idea, Weiss replied. He said it was a good way to make contacts and make them remember me. I guess it's hard to argue with that logic, Yang said sarcastically. You don't argue with my father, Weiss sighed. If he tells you to do something, you do it. Yang looked like she was about to say something, but she clearly decided against it. That's unfair, was all she ended up saying a couple of seconds later. I know, but it's the way things are, Weiss sighed. Honestly, the way people describe him makes it hard to believe he's okay with you being into girls. The words left Yang's mouth just as Weiss was about to swallow, the accuracy catching her off guard and causing her to take a sharp intake of breath and making the food clog her windpipe. As she coughed to clear her throat, she saw Yang leap off the couch and return a moment later with a glass of water, which she eagerly accepted and began to gulp down. "Are you okay?" Weiss gave a short nod as she took in deep breaths and coughed away the last of the discomfort. "I'm fine," she croaked once she had succeeded. "Thank you." "Was there a bit of shell or something?" Yang asked and glanced down at the omelette. "No," Weiss said and placed the plate, with a small amount of omelette left, on the table. While she didn't want to scare the girl away, she knew that she had to be honest. "It wasn't the egg." "Good. Did it just go down the row?" "Yang," Weiss interrupted with her head lowered. "My father doesn't know." "Oh." "And you were right, he most definitely would not be okay with it," Weiss said. "So I'm a secret?" "I'm sorry." Weiss shook her head. "I will understand if you want to cancel our date tomorrow." Yang was silent for almost a full minute, and during that time, Weiss couldn't bring herself to look up into the girl's beautiful, violet eyes. "Why would I want to do that?" That wasn't the reply she had been expecting. Nervous about what she would see, she slowly looked up to find that Yang was wearing a small smile. "Because..." "Weiss..." It was Yang's turn to interrupt her. "I'm not gonna pretend that it doesn't bug me a little, and that it won't have to be dealt with eventually, but I like you." Weiss was about to reply, but Yang continued to talk. "I've barely stopped thinking about you since you walked in the store, so yeah, I'm okay with being a secret for a little while, if that's what it takes to see where this can go." "Are you sure?" Weiss asked hesitantly. When my father finds out, things will get ugly very fast." "Then we will deal with it then," Yang replied. She felt Yang's hand take her own, and after a moment of hesitation, Weiss entwined her fingers with the blonde S and allowed the feeling of warmth that crawled up her arm to overtake her. "Okay," Weiss nodded, the warm feeling making her a little more hopeful as she looked into Yang's eyes. Butterfly filled Weiss' stomach, but just as she was about to act upon her thoughts, she was interrupted by the ringing of her scroll. Sad that the moment had been broken, she pulled it from her pocket and looked down at the screen to see Seal's name written across it. "I have to take this," Weiss said apologetically, and Yang simply gave a quick nod. "All right," the girl said as she got up and made her way towards the door. "I'll go and get you a double-shot coffee." With a smile at Yang, she answered the phone. "This is Weiss Schnee." "Hello, ma'am," Seal's voice said. "I'm calling to tell you that the proposal meeting has been moved up to 3. "What, by who?" "Your father, ma'am," the girl replied. "He also asked me to inform you that he will be in attendance." Weiss fought the urge to sigh at hearing the news. "All right," she replied shortly. "I will be there shortly." "Yes, ma'am." With that, she hung up the phone and stood up to leave. As she was making her way through the kitchen, the door to the storefront opened and Yang walked through holding a to-go cup. "Hey, who was it?" Yang asked as she saw her. "My assistant," Weiss replied in a hurry. "My meeting got moved up, so I have to go." "Oh, okay," Yang smiled. "Well, if we are gonna keep this a secret, you probably should go out the back, right? The store's a little full." "Right." Weiss followed Yang back through the door to the stairs, but this time instead of leading her up them, she instead led her through a door at the bottom of them into an alleyway behind the store. "Your coffee," Yang said as she held out the cup. "Thank you," Weiss said as she accepted it. "So tomorrow at 8? "I'll be waiting." "Perfect." Weiss smiled and began to slowly walk backwards. "And Yang, just for the record, I really like you too." With the wide smile that had just stretched its way across Yang's face and printed in her mind, Weiss turned and made her way towards her waiting car.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.